Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Father Columbus Stewart, the Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and also to introduce our speaker this afternoon. This is the second year of a partnership between Himmel and the Collegeville Institute for residential fellows in the study of Eastern Christian manuscripts. With the generosity of a benefactor, Jean Manas and his wife, Rebecca Haile, who is the daughter of our curator emeritus of Ethiopian manuscripts, Getachew Haile, Jean and Rebecca have made it possible for us to invite scholars from around the world to spend a semester or even a full year in residence at the Collegeville Institute, participating in the life of that community while doing work on Himmel's collections in Eastern Christian manuscripts. So in this fall semester, the second year of that program, we've been delighted to welcome Dr. Anton Pritula from St. Petersburg, Russia, to be with us to work on some of our recently digitized collections of Syriac manuscripts. Although his title, Syriac Poetry of the Mongol Times, may seem to verge on the esoteric, in fact, as he will explain to us this afternoon, it's extremely timely. The area he is working in is an area where Himmel has been quite active in recent years in northern Iraq, and he'll be speaking about someone associated with the ancient city of Arbela, modern Erbil, where Himmel's partner in manuscript work in Iraq, Father Najib Mikhail, known to many of you from the Collegeville Institute from his time there, has recently taken refuge, having been driven from first their historic home in Mosul, and then most recently this summer, the Christian village of Karakosh in northern Mesopotamia. This period, the Mongol era in the history of that region, was also a time of tumult, of destruction, and unexpected new creation. Now the Christians of that region feel destruction. Let us hope that somehow they experience some of the new creation that we'll hear about this afternoon. Dr. Pritula has a distinguished curriculum vitae, trained originally in Iranian studies, studying Persian and the history of Iran and its rich culture, deep expertise in art history and curatorship experience of that at the famous Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and also expertise in Syriac manuscripts, which is what is brought him here. We first met in Malta in 2008 at the Symposium Syriacum, and we've been corresponding about a collection of Chaldean Syriac manuscripts which had last been seen in the late 1960s by William Macomber, who was a cataloger here at Himmel in the 70s and 80s, formerly a member of the Society of Jesus, who had worked as a teacher at their mission in Baghdad. William Macomber had seen a manuscript collection in Mardin in southeast Turkey, and then it vanished from view. And I spent several of my early years as director of Himmel trying to find out what happened to those manuscripts. Had they gone to Iraq, as many people thought they had? Had they disappeared, been stolen, or destroyed? And we discovered they had never left Mardin at all. But it was, as so often the case, a matter of finding the guy with the key and then persuading him to let us come in and work with him. And we did that through Father Najib. And I was able finally to tell you that we had those manuscripts, which made this research possible. So, on behalf of the Collegeville Institute, if I can dare to say that, John, and certainly of our community at Himmel, I introduce our speaker, who will suggest to us why the many mysteries held in these ancient manuscripts can be of extraordinary inspiration and even surprising relevance for those of us today. Dr. Pritula.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Father Columber and the Himmel team for giving me an opportunity to work with these manuscripts, which are actually unique and which were not available for the scholars for several decades. So actually I'm maybe one of the first ones, or even the first one, who can work with them and use them for the research. Before starting my presentation, I would like to mention several facts which may be actually well known. The first is that Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, to speak precise, it's an Eastern dialect of Aramaic, which was actually a kind of lingua franca in the Near East in the first centuries of our era. And it is also very interesting that the first state which proclaimed Christianity as a state religion was Edessa, a small city, a Syriac city, an Aramaic city in the north Mesopotamia, and it was in the 2nd century AD, which is much earlier than in Byzance or in the Roman Empire or even in Armenia. And it is also very interesting that Syriac culture and Syriac tradition is possibly the only one which is represented in all three main Oriental Christian denominations. The first one is so-called monophysites, which is represented in so-called Jacobite church. The second one is Melkites or Chalcedonites, which is also represented in many Syriac manuscripts. And the third one, of which we are going to talk, is an Nestorian tradition, so-called Church of the East. And it is also very important that this small minority was, till the 14th century, one of the biggest Christian denominations of the world. This is an approximate area of communities of the adherents to this church, how it was spreading through the centuries, especially since the 5th, 7th centuries till the 14th centuries. So such regions as Central Asia, India, and even China faced Christianity first just through the missions of Church of the East, of the Nestorian, so-called Nestorian Church. And the archaeologists find a lot of artifacts in all this huge area belonging to the Church of the East, like gravestones, monasteries, churches, and so on. Until the last years, the main attention of the scholars was attracted to the Syriac literature of 4th to 6th, 7th centuries, such as Ephraim, Narsai, Isaac of Nineveh, which are treated as classical. Rather few attention was paid to the Syriac literature after the Arabic conquest, when Christianity was becoming a religious minority, and even the adherents were to use Arabic language in many spheres of life. Nevertheless, despite the military invasions, and in the first place that of Mongols in the period of 13th, early 14th centuries, a whole constellation of first-class poets appeared, such as Yohanan bar Zobi, Yohanan of Mosul, Kamis bar Kardaki, Gabriel of Mosul, Abdisho bar Briho, whose heritage is almost not studied so far. In this period, probably under the influence of Arabic poetry, the sphere of Syriac poetic usage expands. Many poets also wrote commentaries on the scriptures, theological tracts, grammars in verse. This period has been recently characterized as the Syriac Renaissance, the term used by Professor Hermann Toyle for the period of 11th till 14th centuries. Among the spiritual poetry of the Church of the East, so-called Nestorian, of that period, the Vada hymnological collection or book holds a special place. This is just samples of the earliest manuscripts of this book, which were digitized by Himmel and which I'm working with. Among the, even judging by the titles of the hymns, many men of letters living from 12th to the 16th century participated in its creation. This large hymnological book is meant for the liturgical performance at night services of the festival days and Sundays of all the liturgical year. These two peculiarities make it the main monument of the East Syrian liturgical poetry. Its numerous manuscripts are known in different collections of the world. Strophic hymns, or nitha, plural niyata, contained in the collection are still a part of the liturgy of the East Syrian Church. Altogether, in the collection there are over 130 hymns, most of which are ascribed to Gevardis Varga. whose name provides the name of the whole corpus. Due to the contents, one can distinguish the hymns as exegetic, hagiographic, rendering apocryphal narratives, describing historical events and calamities. An average manuscript of the Vada hymn collection, such as this, contains over 230 folio recto verso, which is about 460 pages of big dimensions. There is no information concerning the life of this hymnographer, but it is traditionally believed that he lived in the first half of the 13th century. As in the hymns related to his name, there are descriptions of the terrible events which took place in 1220s, 1230s. However, no thorough attribution of the hymns contained in the collection has been made so far. Therefore, it is possible that some of them were included later. Most of the hymns in this book are rhymed and reflect a stage of the development of Syriac poetry, which had already begun interacting with Muslim surrounding, by which I mean Arabic and Persian poetic tradition. The edition of the Varda hymns by Heinrich Hilgenfeld in 1904, which comprises in the original text in German translation only 9 hymns, was long a main publication of this whole corpus. Among these hymns, there are 4 about famine and other disasters, among which there is one on the capture of the village Karmelish in North Mesopotamia by Mongols in 1235. Also the following hymns, one on reproaching a deacon who converted to Islam, and a hymn about John the Baptist. This edition was strongly criticized by Anton Baumstark, a great German serologist, who published a review on it. Besides, Hilgenfeld's edition included less than 10% of the whole collection, and besides, it was based only on the Berlin and Vatican manuscripts. I actually have been working on this corpus for several years, and I recently published an edition and a detailed monograph study on this hymnological book. And this is a Russian version which has just came out. It consists of a monograph and of this edition. This is a critical text on the left, and on the right is a parallel Russian translation. So just to make a critical edition means to make it you need to have access to all the existing manuscripts. Then you choose a basic manuscript, which should be the most respectful and possibly the oldest one. Then you choose it as a basic text, and all the differences in other manuscripts which you just place down into the apparat. And the problem was the whole this work, this book, Russian version, took about 700 pages, and now I'm just supposed to prepare an English version which is ready, and it should be published next year. But the problem was that I had no access to the earliest and to the best manuscripts of this book. So marked in red, this is a checklist for all existing manuscripts of this book, which I have to take into consideration. It is arranged into a chronological principle, and marked in red are the manuscripts which were not available till now. And they are the earliest and the best ones, and they are available only here in Hymno. So it is a great, actually they were treated as lost for many decades, and now they are available, and it's a very good thing. Among the researchers, the word unitha, answer, is generally accepted to mean a verse from the psalm, performed by the chorus as a refrain after each stanza of such a hymn. In the modern Church of the East, this verse is read only before the text of the hymn, and it is usually written in the manuscripts. Later, the term unitha was transferred to the poetical text itself, and thus a new genre was developed. The liturgical place of the unithas, which make up the Vada book, is the night service, so-called Teshmeshte Dlelia in Syriac. In the modern Church of the East, such unithas are performed by two choirs in turn, 2 stanzas each. The introduction and conclusion of each hymn is recited by the priest. Now I hope it works. So just a moment. Here we and so on. In the medieval time, performance of the hymns was closely connected with the bema, so a U-shaped eminence in the center of the church of each temple or chapel, which was multifunctional in the Church of the East. The choir was situated there, and also the Apostle book was read from bema, and there the bishop's throne was located. Actually, the altar itself was used only for the anaphora. The bema is reputed to have vanished after the 14th century, and this entailed a serious redistribution in the performance of liturgical texts. It might be supposed that the refrain, namely unitha, performed by the bema, ceased to exist with the vanishing of the letter, but it concerns only the refrain. Although such a refrain was still copied for centuries, it gradually disappeared from the manuscripts. It is well known that the East Syrian liturgical year consists of 9 7-week periods. They are Annunciation and Christmas, the second Epiphany, the third Lent, fourth Resurrection, fifth Apostles, sixth Summer, seventh Iliad and the Cross, eighth Moses, and ninth Church Consecration, which is the shortest period which lasts only 4 weeks. The main liturgical books, including the Vada collection, are based on this pattern. The hymns of unithas, as it is seen from the structure of the Vada book, are required at all Sunday services, services for movable and immovable feasts, and also at the services of rogation of Ninevites, and at the commemoration of different saints. To reconstruct the primary structure of this book, I just made a table of the hymns. This is not one, this is placed in the book, and it took about 50 pages just to list all the existing hymns in different manuscripts. From it, one could see that the hymns attributed to Gevargius Varga himself and comprising the basis of this collection are quite consistent as to form, rhyme and meter. The hymns attributed to other authors, or anonymous, often differ in form, representing a great variety of meters and rhyme habits. In different manuscripts of the Vada hymnological collection, one can find a Christmas service hymn entitled On the Book of Childhood of Christ. The use of famous apocryphal book by the poet is undoubted, because it is mentioned several times in the text. The first mention of it is found in the title, and this should certainly be from later period, as it is usually the case with the titles in liturgical books. A quotation. Another one on the feast of Christmas, and it is on the book of the childhood of Christ by Walter. By contrast, the reference to it at the end of the text could belong to the author himself. Quotation. I have arranged into a hymn the miracles of the book of childhood. This hymn also gives us a dating for the lost Nestorian prose version of Book of the Childhood of Christ, which might have appeared no later than in the first half of the 13th century, when Gevargis Varda lived. Just a quotation, a sample of such a passage from the Apocrypha. Quotation. And while he, Christ, was growing up among children and playing with clay, all the images he had made were walking to a place he had ordered. Once the children ran up and hid in a furnace. The son of their Lord asked their mothers, "Where are they?" They replied to him, "There are no children there, only kids and goats." And he raised his voice, "Come, children," for they wanted to become goats. The children changed and suddenly became goats, the black and spotted. And they surrounded him, bleating. Their parents approached, bowing to their shepherd, that he might free them. And he opened his mouth and said to them, "Come, children," and they became humans. This is a very typical and even classical example of an apocryphal passage, which is also met in different versions of the Book of Childhood Apocrypha. To sum up, the hymn under discussion is a very interesting example of how Apocrypha were liturgically used in the East Syriac Church with a direct reference to it in the text. Because in most of the churches, Apocrypha were just forbidden and they were not referred to. It is also well known that apocryphal subjects are exerted a very strong influence into the whole liturgical tradition of almost all the churches. But they usually are not referred directly because the Apocrypha themselves were not allowed and approved by the official church. And here in the Church of the East, we can see just an exception. Another Christmas hymn is dedicated to the adoration of the Persian Magi rulers who came to Bethlehem from Iran. The hymn gives the name of 12 Magi, although there are discrepancies in different manuscripts. Here you can see that. In the East Syrian Church literature, the 12 Magi are mentioned repeatedly both in hymns and theological works. Supposedly, the story of the Magi, as can be seen from the examples of other hymns. The aim of the author of the Unither was just to adorn an old known tradition into a form corresponding to new aesthetic requirements. The famous Book of the Bee by Shlomo of Achlat, the Metropolitan of Basra, first half of the 13th century, also gives the list of the 12 Magi, whose names coincide with the hymn in the whole, and he also tells of their personalities. The Book of the Bee tells that each group of the four from the list brought one of the three types of gifts: gold, incense, and myrrh correspondingly. In the last years, several articles were published in this issue. The most detailed one was the study by Victor Vitakovsky. In the same hymn from the Varda collection, Zoroaster, or in Syriac Zaradosh, is mentioned as a prophet who foretold the future coming of Messiah Christ and taught the Magi to adore him. It is no doubt that here the famous Iranian Zoroastrian prophet is meant. Just quotation from the hymn. And Zarathustra, prophet of Zoroaster, prophesied and said to Persians, and told them clearly, and instructed them so. When the time allotted fulfills, and the destined epoch comes, the Savior will draw near, the manifested God. In the 8th century, Theodore Barkoni, the famous East Syriac theologian, developed concept of Zoroaster's prophecy about Christ. And in the 9th century, he was followed by Ishodad of Merv in his commentary on the Gospels. In the book of the Bee by Shlemon of Akhlaq, a special chapter is dedicated to Zarathustra's prophecy, where he is presented as the origin of such tradition and is identified with Baruch the scribe. Such, there are grounds to believe that this notion of Zarathustra became quite popular or even dominant in Nestorian church circles. As it was shown by Sebastian Brock and Witakovsky, this concept, bearing a certain Zoroastrian mythopoetic element of the expected savior, in Persian, Soashyan, was probably created by East Syrians converted to Christianity from Zoroastrianism. It was mostly in the 6th century. There is no opportunity here to analyze all the numerous examples of using Apocrypha in the Varda hymns. Some of them do not have direct parallels in other texts because the prose originals didn't survive, and that makes such hymns a unique source. Among all the periods of the liturgical year, the 3 days of the arrogation of Ninevites, celebrated 3 weeks before the Lent, are the richest and most diverse in themes. The East Syrian tradition traces the origin of the arrogation of the Ninevites to the time of the Persian Sasanian domination. The liturgical books state that the fast was initiated in the 6th century by Savrisho, the Metropolitan of Beth Slav, during the severe plague epidemic, which spread in Beth Garmai, Athur, and Nineveh, which is also of Iraq, and ceased after the fast had been imposed. Although it is also possible that such a fast anticipating Lent emerged before the 5th century, as it can be also found in West Syriac and Coptic churches. Theologically, the arrogation of the Ninevites is a commemoration of the prophetical mission of Jonah, who according to the biblical text preached in pagan Nineveh, threatening with the destruction of the city if the citizens would not repent. As it is known from the book of Jonah, which is also read after this service, they turned to repentance and the city survived. There are 2 hymns on this prophet and his mission in the Varda book. They describe disaster took place in the same region as the events of the book of Jonah in Mesopotamia, medieval Iraq, whereby the way the fast, this fasting, was founded in Christian times. The bond between the generations, the contemporaries of the author of the hymns, and their ancestors, the Ninevites, is emphasized in a number of hymns, and is a sort of compositional pivot for the hymns of the circle. God says to Jonah, a quotation, "I do not shun sinners who repent, and to the last times the Ninevites will testify to my mercy." Then, at the end of the same text, on the behalf of the author, the choir sings, "O you who accepted that supplication and who had pity on that city, accept the supplication accept this supplication and and have mercy on this city." So this connection is quite clear. Two hymns about Jonah are meant to be recited on Wednesday, the last day of the service of the Rogation, when the book of Jonah is recited. and according to some of the liturgical books, it is read entirely, the whole book. But the others report that only part of it is read. Other hymns of the circle contain descriptions of various disasters borrowed from biblical narratives, like the deluge, the destruction of Sodom. Besides, there are hymns in the cycle containing the descriptions of and events contemporary with the author, such as plague, hunger, drought, foreign invasions that took place in the early 13th century. Most often, these concern various catastrophes and present a kind of dreadful documentation of the epoch. They also provide us with an exact dating for the events, and as it stands in the titles of those hymns, most of them refer to 1220s, 1230s. Just some samples of these descriptions. Quotation. Rain, which is granted as help, was to cause ruin that winter. It was a destroyer of houses and a murderer for the inhabitants. Hunger, cruel and strong, and disease, hard and pernicious, by far exceeded the plague which was in the time of the blessed David. The hungry ones cried in the streets, and sick people moaned at home. Dogs ate the dead, and the living envied the dead. Then there are also hymns, some of hymns describing the locust invasions. Multitude of locusts gathered and flew there, sounding like peals of thunder. People had heard nothing like that, the old and the elderly. What had been grown in the soil for 4 months disappeared in 9 hours. The reapers returned ashamed, and the sowers beat their breasts. And there are also, in the same hymn, there is a description of the plague epidemic, which actually also broke out in the same years. Another pest spread, leprosy, cruel and harsh. Glory to the mercy of the merciful, who kept and left us the one who survived. Cruel boils were all over the body, swellings and heat drops all over the flesh, moaning in all the thoughts, pain in all the contemplations. I'm just quoting some passages which seem to be most typical. Properties are gone because of famine, and proprietors because of plague, and nobody purchases properties, and nobody inherits mammon. Buildings which used to be glorious and resound with voices of assemblies unexpectedly became a dwelling of owls and an object of fright for spectators. For they built and erected their houses to sit and rejoice in them. However, they had never sat in them, nor had their children inherited them. Some sold everything they had and made themselves slaves, but couldn't by any means save themselves from death. Some fell asleep inside the houses, and neighbors are unaware. The dogs eat their bodies and gnaw their limbs. And some eat the flesh of the dead, and some gnaw the extracted bones, and some suck the blood out with their mouths, and at the end die of despair. The plain naturalism of this corpus is amazing not only for liturgical texts, but for the literary monuments in general. However, it might be not surprising for medieval literature. The naturalistic descriptions are quite standard and repeat from hymn to hymn in the description of global catastrophes. Therefore, they are perhaps to be considered as literary method for the genre to call them catastrophe hymns. Books, just another small example, and actually the last one. Books have vanished with their readers, and pupils with their teachers, writers and their writings have become extinct, and pastors and their flocks. Houses are abandoned by the dwellers and streets by walkers. Churches have become like caverns, and villages a dwelling of jackals. On the whole, the hymns on the relegation of Ninevites are notable for their thematic diversity. One of the most fascinating hymns, belonging to the same cycle, discusses the problem of inequality in the human society. In each stanza, first two verses depict the life of the rich, and the next two verses the life of the poor, so that each stanza contains an opposition. I have looked at this world and paid attention to its orders, and was amazed at its inequality. I was astonished at its dirtiness, and pondered on its stratification. I wanted to count them and desired to reflect on them. It's quite a long hymn, so I will just read some stanzas of it. Some, since the day they were born, are carried and raised, and some, since they have come out of the womb, roll on the ground and ashes. Some do not drink excellent wines without having strained them, and some wish for something cool, but not a drop is shed in their mouths. Some, as soon as they step on the ground, are prepared a comfortable carriage. Some wander barefoot on the earth, stumbling over thistles. In the second half of the 13th century, the political and economical situation much changed. The new Mongol dynasty of Ilkhans, founded in 1258, captured Baghdad, and having killed the last Abbasid caliph, established a new non-Muslim state in Iraq and Iran. This period, namely 60s till 90s of the 13th century, can be treated as an experience of religious tolerance unique for the Middle Ages. As the wives of many Khans, Mongol rulers, were Christian historian, it is quite natural that Christian churches got access to the royal court. The most important historical event of that period was a visit of East Syriac Nestorian monk Rabban Sauma to Rome in 1287, which is carefully described in his biography. Rabban Sauma, called now Eastern Marco Polo, was born in modern-day Beijing, Peking, China, and was of Turkic Uyghur origin. He spent a long time in the Nestorian Christian monasteries in China and Central Asia, and then made a long way from China as a pilgrim to Jerusalem with his disciple named Mark. Here one can see the way they made. But he had to stay in the Ilkhans, Iran and Iraq for some time. Then he set out to Europe as an envoy of Ilkhan's ruler Argun to ask the Pope and the European kings for the military help against Muslim Egyptian Mamluk dynasty. The final goal of such military company could be taking back Jerusalem from the Muslim control. Rabban Sauma traveled with a large company of assistants, 30 riding animals, and several interpreters. He likely didn't speak any European languages, though he is known to be fluent in Chinese, Turkish, and Persian. This change of the church's social position found its reflection in the Christian spiritual poetry. Kamis Bar-Kardaki, in East Syriac author of that period, may be called a great experimenter and reformer of the Syriac poetry. He lived in Arbil, Arbela, northern Iraq, the capital of today's Kurdistan. And this city is mentioned in his poems many times. Unlike Varda, he faced a challenge to create poetical pieces in his native Syria. In a way, it could fit the court banquets held by Ilkhan rulers. In one of his short poems, he mentioned that it was composed when he was staying in the Khan's residence to amuse Mongols. Some of his poems have purely secular character. Khamis used the forms of traditional Persian court poetry, such as short pieces, ghazals, and quatrains, called in Persian rubai, for which most famous was Omar Khayyam, famous Persian poet. And this is quite unusual for the Syriac tradition of the earlier period. One of his short poems, which was never published or studied before, may be treated as a parody on the Persian lyrical ghazals. Each verse of it is written in Syriac sentences with incorporated Persian expressions. So it's a kind of combination of two languages, which might have aimed a comic effect. I would quote just several verses, and in order to transmit that kind of bilingual pattern, I translated the Syriac parts into English and the Persian expressions into German. I haven't seen such a beauty we do, elegant, freely, and brennend. I say, komm zu mir, let us drink wine. We are zusammen day and night. And so the poem is made like that. The heritage of this outstanding poet was not studied till 2010, when the article by David Taylor came out. Since that time, several works were published by Alessandro Mingozzi and myself, where many interesting pieces were examined. But the earliest existing manuscript of Khamis' poems was not available until it was digitized by the hymn team. My current project is a study in this amazing poetic book and its critical edition. In 1310, a great massacre broke out in Arbela. As a result of a conflict, most of the Christian population was murdered by the Muslim crowd. Numerous persecutions and invasions, the most terrible of which was the Tamerlane's time, reduced East Syrian community to a tiny minority and eliminated most of its cultural achievements. That is the only possible explanation why the above-mentioned outstanding authors remain almost unknown to the world society. Thank you very much for the attention.
We will take some questions. Questions, comments?
Yeah, please.
If you find dates in some of these manuscripts, what calendar do they use?
Oh, they use their own Syriac Aramaic calendar, which is typical for this culture. And they use this Syriac calendar, but they use Seleucid era, which was the era. It is one thing. It is Hellenistic. Seleucid era is Hellenistic, and the names of the months are Aramaic, which are supposedly borrowed from originally from Babylon. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, a follow up on that. So the Seleucid calendar continued to be used through I know it was used in the Parthian period. It continued to be used through the Sasanian period and beyond as well.
What do you mean? What was used?
The Seleucid calendar?
Yeah, actually.
That continued to be used through the Sasanian period as well and even beyond.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in your talk the incorporation of Zoroastrian traditions into some of the poetry. I was wondering if is it simply the themes that are incorporated, or do texts like the Zendavesta find themselves being excerpted and put into the poetry itself?
Actually, I think it's another topic. So Avesta and Persian Zoroastrian poetry is quite another topic. I would like to discuss it with you because it's it has no direct connection to the Syriac Christianity, but there were the Avestian plots and subjects were then rendered in poetical form also after the Islamic conquest by Zoroastrians. to preserve their tradition in poetical form. So I think I would say that it is the same as this Syriac Christian did, but not by Christian communities, but by Zoroastrians. So in this Christian text, actually I haven't found any direct borrowings from Avesta or something. Yeah, please.
In the Gospels of Jesus' childhood, does Jesus ever have any siblings?
Any what?
Brothers or sisters?
Not mentioned.
Oh.
In this one, not mentioned. There are a lot of other strange things, but no brothers and sisters.
Anton, has your work here confirmed what you might already have suspected or expected to find, or have you had some surprises?
Yeah, I actually had some surprises, especially with this this manuscript of Hamis from Arbela, because there were some interesting things there, because some later attributions in the titles of the hymns were just taken from newer manuscripts. And here is the oldest one. One can see that the text and the titles were much changed. For example, in the later manuscripts, it is told that also David Taylor, who used the newer manuscripts, reported that he had children. Because he wrote a poem on the death of his son. But it says in the title that it was written and composed on the death of his son. But in 2 or 3 earliest manuscripts which are here, there is the poem is still there, but there is not a word, no word about that it was composed for the son. So and just on the contrary, some scribe who wrote probably the first manuscript just wrote that I just scribed the heritage of my old how would you say it in ascetic tradition. Sava, Father Kalam.
Yeah, my monastic elder.
Yeah, exactly, my monastic elder. So one could suppose that Hamis was just on the contrary a monk. And this is the earliest manuscript, which was probably scribed from the autograph, from the original, which was made by the author, by Hamis himself, by his disciple. It was not known at all.
What kind of manuscripts have the stories about the 10 magi? Pseudo gospels or hymns or?
The one I cited is in hymn, but there are also very detailed theological tracts on it, with the names, with the characters. So actually, there are 2 different traditions. The Western one with 3 magi and so on, and the Oriental one with 10th one, 12 ones, which closely associate them to Persian and Iranian culture, and all those names are actually Iranian in origin. So, which was probably just the reason was just that they lived in that surrounding in Iran and Iraq, and that influenced their culture and church tradition.
Would you find artwork with the 10 magi?
Sorry?
Artwork, are there pictures of the 10 magi?
Me not, but I'm quite sure that there are some pictures of the magi. Some of them were found, I think, in Jerusalem. I'm not quite sure, but not found, but I think there were some descriptions of the magi fresco in Jerusalem in Sasanian sword, because in the 6th century the Sasanian Iranians captured Jerusalem, and there was some description of that. So, but I'm not quite sure how many they were.
Was there artwork in the manuscripts that you examined?
Not too much, just like decoration of the titles. So no miniatures.
No miniatures.
No miniatures.
Except that when you were showing the pages, it looked like the ink was different colors at different points.
Actually, it is unique. because it's not, I think, for the Vardar hymn collection, it is the only one, actually it is the earliest one, and it is the only one with different colors. Usually it is just black ink for the text and red color for the titles. And the blue one is not typical, that's why I asked Wayne to show this one, because it's unusual. But in general, I would say that the quality of scribing and of decoration was deteriorating each century after Islamic conquest. So I mean that the quality of the text, the quality of calligraphy, for example, in the 16th century, is much better than in the 7th. In the 7th, better than in the 18th. So it is 18th. It is like that. So the main task is just to get a good text for publication, for translation. It's just, in this case, at least to get several 16th century things like that. Because the later you got, the more mistakes you have.
Anton, you spoke about the bilingual poems where they had
Yeah.
language. Did you find that to be unique? Or was that the start of a tradition?
And actually, there is also by the same author, there is a poem, Turkic Syriac poem, which also was edited by me this year. But actually it's not so typical. So it is either one language or other. You know, there is Garshuni tradition. It is like in Arabic or Persian, but in Syriac script. But a combination is not very typical.
Were there other poets at the time or afterwards who copied that style?
Actually, it's difficult to say, but I won't say it was much followed by the Syriac tradition. And one of the reasons is that it was just cut by different invasions, massacres, and so on. But I would say that in general, this type of poems was originally borrowed from Persian and Arabic poetry, especially from Persian. They have a genre of its own. When, for example, one verse was in Arabic and the second one in Persian. They just were experimenting in using different traditions.
I don't know where to begin, but the Christianity going into the East, Far East, story of the 6th century with Nestorian into China, the Syriac and Chinese as bilingually documented on stone monuments. Right? So, and it's been legibly known that is the effort of Buddhism and Nestorian working together side by side. How has that been? I don't know what to ask, but
I understand the question. I'm not, but Father Gon, do you have several minutes? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
please, thank you very much.
Give a little history lesson.
No.
I think that
Just generally speaking, it was complicated because in different periods, the attitude of the government officials, of the rulers to the Christian communities was quite different. So, like in the Tang period, I don't know exactly the date, they were completely permitted. So everything we had is still maybe. So there were there were two periods of spreading Christianity in Central Asia and China. It was the first one was before 10th century, and the second one was 13th, 14th century. So it is complicated. Mongol time.
So that the influence of Buddhism and Christianity working together has ever been documented other than the
It's very now I would say it's a very popular theme topic because there is a literature like from Turfan. It's a huge corpus of texts which and a lot of scholars like Mark Dickens, Erica Hunter just research the Buddhist influence in the terms, in the style, and everything. Because it's quite clear that, especially in Turfan, in Central Asia, they used some Buddhist terms to transfer them, to express Christian terms. Actually, there were several articles and works on this account. And if you see, for example, even these steles, like, there are several very famous steles. You will see also Chinese influences, Buddhist influences. So it's very interesting, actually.
Is there any of that documents are here in hymnal library?
They're not things that we ourselves photographed, but we have some of the modern publications. And there's some very interesting work being done now by Chinese scholars, working with European scholars. There's an annual conference on this, and they've been publishing the proceedings, which we have copies of in the Alcuin Library. Or maybe they're in our collection, I have to look. But if you're interested, you can flush out the bibliography, because some of our friends are very involved in these cooperative projects of archaeology and documentary history.
And also there is a very interesting book by Li Tang, a Chinese scholar who now works in Salzburg, which is called An Historic Christianity in China. And she discusses all these steles, texts, and I find it very interesting.
So Li Tang is the key person, and then Dietmar Winkler at the University of Salzburg is the one who's been organizing a lot of this work. So we should probably wrap up, but let me just say a little word about these manuscripts that he was talking about, these oldest manuscripts. You saw the list, they were in Mardin and they were in Diyarbakir. And I think it's worth noting that these are manuscripts that were held by the original community until this very day. So we heard about some of the struggles that they faced in earlier centuries, times of persecution, times of relative freedom, then times of massacre. But these towns of Mardin and Diyarbakir were largely Christian cities in southeast Turkey until the 1920s. So these were the communities that persevered through centuries and centuries of successive, hostile rule and managed to hold on to their culture and their language until the great massacres of the early 20th century. So the Armenian genocide is famous. What's lesser known is that these communities of Syriac Christians in the same part of the world suffered equally. And so what you have left in Diyarbakir now, a handful of Christians, maybe 10 Christian families in a very large center now of Kurdish nationalism in southeast Turkey. Mardin, a city of 75,000 people, a real center, about 100 Christian families left. One functioning church and a priest. The church where these manuscripts were found has not had a priest since the late 60s. But there are a couple families that keep the keys and preserve the tradition and have 750 manuscripts like this. So one of the great privileges of our work is being able to get to know these people and then build a relationship which allows us to make these things available. And then to welcome people like you
Thank you very much.
to be with us. So thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you.